I'm good. Juan is on his way. I think I figured everything else out except for the cameras. The mute button is working though. That's good. The live stream's working. It seems like we're not gonna have to update the just the cameras. On the no, it's the little thing blinked. At least when I click power, like I've never seen them. I've never seen them like completely turn like this though.
Yeah, it's not the first thing. Is there anything? Because I don't work in your
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I appreciate it.
Hello, 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 hello.
This.
Live stream is good. Good. Oh, yeah. Yes, it is. All right, sounds good.
We're almost there. We are making progress. So we have a narrow scope for today and a couple things to discuss so that we can prepare for the final meeting on December 7th, where we'll have further discussion. That will also include public comment at the next meeting because we will have published a draft of the things that we will be voting on. And I think I'm going to let Pauline and Renee take turns setting the stage for our conversation for today. Unannounced. Surprise.
So I think we should do roll call.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we should do roll call, like it says.
Yeah.
I'm just learning how to put letters and numbers together. So as we go around for the roll call, let's do our conflicts as well, statement of potential or actual. Jeff Harris with Solaire Home Builders, potential conflicts. Chris?
Chris Madison, Arborist, potential conflicts.
Karen Johnson, community at large, no conflicts.
Sarah Anselman, Ben Parks and Rec, potential conflicts.
Eric Huffman, potential conflict.
Jim Roberts at large, no conflict.
Manoj Alapriya, Human Rights and Equity Commission, no conflict.
And the Choxy Environment and Climate Committee, City of Bend, no conflicts.
Corey Bittner with Polish, potential conflicts.
Gina Franzosa, potential conflict.
Kathy Austin, Architect, Affordable Housing Advisory Committee Rep, no conflict.
Maureen Greenwood, Central Oregon Builders Association, potential conflict.
All right, thank you.
Online.
And online, so we've got Brett online and Dan. Let's start with Brett.
Brett, you.
And Dan Jenkins, landscape architect, potential conflicts.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, now.
Okay. I always like to put the slide up here, even though we've gone over it every time. But we've actually gone through quite a few of these tasks, including number 3 and 4, which is the standards we've come up for the preservation of larger trees and regular trees. And then at the last meeting, we talked about the tree replacement ratios. And so we had one last question at the last meeting that we didn't quite get to, and that was discussing minimum maximum lot sizes to consider for those mitigation options. And so we talked about, if we're going to have a lot size that is of a certain size and smaller, that might be exempt from these tree preservation standards. And the committee asked for staff to look in to see how many lots we have of certain sizes that are vacant today. And so we have some high level data that we put together that gives you the number of tax lots and the total acres for non-residential uses and residential uses. And they're broken down to under a half acre, and then the number of tax lots and total acres between that 1/2 acre and an acre, and then 1 to 2 acres, and anything larger than 2 acres. And so just to go through this, I just want to highlight when our GIS department put this data together, we are just looking at vacant properties that are of these sizes, means that they have a improvement value of less than $20,000 that they're identified in the land division. But if they have a building permit on them, they've been removed from this data so that they're truly vacant. Because if they have a building permit, it's likely that they're going to have some type of structure put on them. And then the non-residential uses up on the screen is their best estimate that they could get from their information systems. So this is just to help you see how many tax lots are in the city. So when we start talking about on the next slide, what size lot, if there is interest, should be exempt from the mitigation standards. So if we just look at, let's just use residential. So under a 1/2 acre, the number of tax lots is 862. And these are cumulative too, so they all add up. If you go to 1.5 to an acre, you add 168 to that. And then 1 to 2 acres is 82. And so that would be the number of tax lots if you went to 2 acres or less, would be all the sum of those 3. So the first, and we can go back.
Sorry, just a quick question. Mm-hmm. And this doesn't take into account, if there were 4 under 1/2 acre parcels that were all contiguous that could be assembled, there's no way to really analyze that in this. So this is just a discrete count of tax lots and acreage so that we have something to look at. But it's not super scientific from a planning or land use analysis standpoint, about where you could put these together and add one to it and make it something larger, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is just intended context for your discussion, but it's super aggregated, very quick query of data. So take it with that.
Thank you.
Okay, so for our discussion today, the first question, is there a development site size that should not be subject to the preservation standards? So the preservation standards is our flow chart. You start at the 20% of the trees 20 inches or larger, then it's 25% of the total DBH. And if they can't do that, then they can go mitigate with on-site tree replacement or a payment in lieu. And so I guess the first question would be, is there a development site that should not be subject to these standards? We talked about some of the smaller parcels. It might be really hard to preserve the trees. And then we go down the list of questions depending on how that is answered.
Is there a quick, before we ask, before we go around, is there a quick way to remind everybody like what type of application would already not be subject to this, or what would be, what's in scope,
Sure.
out of scope to help us?
So in scope, thank you, that's an excellent question. In scope is anything that goes through site plan review. So residential, we're talking about 5 units or more. So multifamily would be subject to this. Your duplex, triplex, quadplex, not subject to this code update at all because they don't go through the site plan review application. And then any project that goes through a land division application, so residential subdivision, a commercial subdivision, those would be subject to this. But the smaller, infill residential lots that are like, 6,000 square feet, they're going to put a duplex on, does not apply.
Okay, that's helpful. And we're still talking about commercial and industrial in the site plan applications
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, so multifamily, commercial, industrial, mixed use, multifamily, and then the land divisions.
So larger scale projects, which was the scope of the council.
Kathy.
So as someone who's designed a lot of infill subdivision type work and townhouse and that sort of thing, I just wanted to start the conversation off. I think that I've done a lot of 8 units to the acre on an acre parcel, and I find that with fire access and turnaround plus utilities and so forth, it's really difficult to save much of anything. But I do think I personally think I'd exempt half acre and acre. I would say that they should still mitigate. Because I think that that's an incentive should there be perimeter trees that are reasonable to keep, that could be kept, and that would meet that. So it's an incentive. Also, it's probably not a lot of trees to mitigate, and the cost probably wouldn't be prohibitive. But I think up to the 1 acre, I would say they don't need to preserve, but they do need to mitigate, so they need to at least survey what they have. And I would agree that on a half acre parcel, most of those are probably going to go into the up to quadplex type of development and not really, even though there's a large number of them, I'm not sure how many of them would actually be impacted by what we do here, but I do think 1 acre parcels would be. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then I wanted to ask a question because Eric, you mentioned industrial properties last time. And I was thinking also that maybe industrial properties don't necessarily need to preserve, but they should mitigate. I would assume in an industrial property, there's parking lots with required parking trees and so forth. That there would be a lot of replanting. So maybe per your discussion earlier is like, well, there's no place to put any trees. Well, yeah, then you do a fee, and that fee could be used in a part of town where it really needs street trees, for instance. So I think it's okay to mitigate, but maybe not in an industrial zone preserve on site, if that makes any sense. So I just wanted to mention, because we did talk about non-residential. Well, I think when it's multifamily or commercial, you have a little more flexibility than you do when it's an industrial.
Would you mind if I clarified? I think I heard you say that in the greater than a half acre up to an acre, treat that differently than under half an acre?
No, from 0 to 1 acre.
Okay, so less than or equal to 1 acre. I heard you say exempt from preservation, but require mitigation.
Correct.
And then essentially similar treatment for industrial.
Industrial, yeah.
Using
Regardless
the
of
acre
size.
size or?
Pardon?
Yeah.
Oh, the size
you would
for
be-
industrial?
It
No.
would be the zoning district for.
The zoning district
Okay.
for
For
industrial.
industrial?
Yeah.
So that is the way that industrial or maybe even commercial can get carved out, is by zoning. I'm just trying to figure out the logistics of it.
Well, I think industrial can only go into industrial zoned property, or did you do very much rezoning for industrial? I didn't think you probably did.
Probably going the other way.
Right,
Yeah.
mostly.
Most of the industrial land is in, the Juniper Ridge and things like that. And it's all just a bunch of junipers, and you got big buildings and big parking lots. So
I mean, I'm not wed to that idea, but I thought that that was a reasonable point that you brought up last time. But I think there should be some mitigation should the trees be removed. It's just that given the industrial nature, preserving on site might not be as important.
And then just to make sure, so this is our first question. The second question is if we're gonna have a floor, so we get down to 5%. So
Yeah, I don't have an opinion on that yet. I wanted to hear what other people have to say.
Yep, and I was just saying, like, even industrial, you know, if we get down to a floor of 5%, that's an option too.
I think I saw a hand from Sarah.
I just wanted to add the potential for affordable housing in industrial zones, though, with Senate Bill 8, and just thinking if we don't require tree preservation, it's a long time. I mean, there's not a ton of sites that are eligible for Senate Bill 8 housing, but affordable housing, I think, benefits more from trees, so I'd hate to see a longer time if some preservation isn't required
So my
in those
thinking
areas.
was a truly industrial use, not just the zoning.
Okay.
So if it went to go housing, that would trigger the residential requirement, in my mind.
Okay,
So
I'm
just
just thinking the area in
clarification.
general, Heat Island and other impacts to the affordable housing and,
Oh, next to.
yeah.
Mhm. Well, if they had mitigation, it might help with that.
Interesting. I'm going to do Chris.
I
and
think
then-
Morgan actually had
Morgan
her
first.
hand
I only
up.
looked to vote. I forgot to state the rules of engagement. Sit to my left if you want to get called in. Sorry, go ahead, Morgan.
I think I just want to, many months ago, sometime in our first or second meeting, we had talked about the potential of the fee in lieu going into a fund from which affordable housing could use to replace trees on site. Is that correct?
Yep.
Has that been, where are we on that?
So once TRUAC wraps up, and we'll have that recommendation where you'll vote on creating the fund, and then staff's going to work on it, but I have a list which includes that fund possibly being allocated towards affordable housing projects. We just need to work with the different departments to see what we can and can't do and establish that fund.
But a majority of this group has confirmed that that fund could be used toward affordable housing.
Yeah, I have that as a recommendation, then I'm gonna work with Mary.
Are you talking about housing itself or?
No, no,
trees
the
for
landscaping,
housing? The
yeah.
landscaping for affordable. Yeah, none of
Yeah.
that is set up, so that's an implementation and staffing issue
Yeah.
that we would have to set up in the future as part of the implementation of that code. There's no framework for that right now.
But it's on the list
Right.
to
It's on
look
the
at
list.
once we create that fund.
So I just want to, in the event that that fund is created per the recommendation of this group, I'm not sure that the same kind of preservation would be necessary for affordable housing in an industrial area. Certainly, the circumstance would be unusual, but because we have this opportunity, it seems like providing the housing and providing access to replacement trees hits both of our priorities, both of the city's priorities.
I was just thinking about a tree not providing maximum benefit for 20-some years, I think.
25.
Not having the shading of impervious surface area and helping to reduce runoff and those things. So I don't have firm opinions yet. I want to hear from everyone. But I just want to throw that in, that that's something to consider.
I would argue that you run the potential of the trees nixing the project entirely. And you don't have the housing because of the trees. I think that's a distinct possibility.
I did mention at another one, though, of having some exemptions for affordable housing. So I'm talking about like an industrial area as a whole. If we raise the temperature of the whole area, we can preserve some trees.
No, I understand that, but you're still potentially putting a project at risk because of the trees. It may not work because they can't do it without cutting down the trees.
And then there's mitigation options and potentially those
Right,
replacement
and I think
trees.
that's where Morgan was going.
Because we had that opportunity, if this fund is created, it seems like it balances it offsets the loss of trees that could push the project in jeopardy.
Sarah does raise a good point, why you would treat trees in an affordable housing in an industrial zone and that project differently than affordable housing projects elsewhere in the city. Like why would there not be tree preservation for that particular project? Because of the underlying, the people that live there don't necessarily know the underlying zoning, they just live there, right? And live in an affordable housing project. I think it would be possible to draft a code where if there was an affordable housing project in the industrial zone, certain standards then kick in, if that's what the committee wanted to do. Because you raise a good point, that is a big change in state law, that housing is allowed in industrial zone. That used to be completely disallowed. And now in all zones, affordable housing has to be allowed. So that is something to consider.
So I just want to clarify again, I was not saying that we shouldn't preserve trees in the zone. It's just if there was an industrial use proposed.
Yeah.
So that, so if there was housing in an industrial zone, they'd still preserve trees. And I think what you were saying is, well, if they're adjacent to the industrial zone and those trees aren't there, that's a negative heat island effect. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah.
And that you're understanding what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's what I heard too.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying. We're going to go to Chris and then Covey after that.
There's more a clarifying question, but from my understanding, I think what we're pushing forward right now is basically, it kind of goes to the flow chart where first, if you can hit this percentage of trees saved, then that's great. And if not, then it goes to mitigation. Is that?
Well, first is the 20% of the priority trees, then 25% of the overall DBH, and then to mitigation.
Okay, gotcha. So I guess I'm wondering how, because essentially if we kept even the half acre or the smaller lots, they'd go through that same flow chart. So at some point, to Kathy's point, it'd be mitigation at some point, because like you said, in a lot of smaller lots, there'll be that one large tree in the middle, and unless you want a donut house, then I mean, I worked on one cool one that had a tree in the middle. But anyway, yeah, so it would eventually go through the same check mark. So it eventually would get to mitigation anyways. So I guess it seems like we would have a tree code that's already covering all those steps, or am I missing something?
Well, the second step of this meeting today is to talk about, are we going to allow sites? So let's say we come up with an acre or smaller, just exempt. And then the next question is the acre and larger properties. Are we going to require a floor?
Okay, and so we're saying different percentage of trees retained, different percentage of priority trees retained.
Yeah, so
for
if there's like a
certain zones.
smaller property like the one you described, and it is difficult to build on because it is smaller, like a half acre, you know, maybe it's not practical to set the 20% and allow them to clear cut the property. And if they clear cut the property, the second question is, would they be required to mitigate? So if we go that route, then the second question is, okay, so now we have an acre or larger, we want to set a floor because they are no longer exempt like those smaller properties, and is 5% the right number?
Gotcha. So the question is really, should we change the thresholds for what we have in place on different lot sizes and or zoning types?
Well, we were focused on lot sizes.
Lot sizes, sorry.
And the reason this question first came up for us is at one of the prior meetings, there was discussion of should we, you know, we're trying to incentivize tree preservation. We're also trying to balance that with housing production. And if focusing more density, more housing downtown or in certain areas to further incentivize that, assuming those might be smaller lots, should we just forego tree preservation to get the housing in the more dense, presumably smaller lots, or not? We weren't sure if that was another way to try to facilitate housing without, you know, on balance, saving trees on the larger lots where there's more room to alter site design too. So it's really, I mean, it's a question to the group.
So I think Karen next.
Okay.
Or were you?
Couple of things. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article for the Bend Bulletin on what is really happening concerning affordable housing. Affordable housing is people making up to 80% of the area median income, which is about $76,000 in Bend. Your workforce housing are people earning between 80 and 120% and of the AMI. 3 years ago, when interest rates were very, very low, according to my calculation, a person would need at least $100,000 back then to buy a $400,000 house. And that's using the 25% total housing cost a part of your budget. Even 3 years ago, the median price for a house was $560,000. And so the average teacher, police officer, fireman, 3 years ago, they could not afford workforce housing. And of course, today, with renters, God knows what it would be. So I don't think trees are a factor in terms of whether someone can afford to buy a home. Someone had mentioned, I think, that putting a tree in a backyard would cost between $5,000 and $8,000. We had to do that a couple of meetings ago. The trees are not the problem. The problem is the price of houses in Bend, which is due to the fact that rich people are moving here from all over the country. Constitutionally, we cannot keep them out, and we cannot control what they do. I've already thought about that. Can't do it. And so the idea that trees are affecting affordable housing, that ain't true. The second thing I urge everyone to do, if you don't take the Bend Bulletin, is take a look at the November 2nd issue. This is not affordable housing. This project is being built off of Century Drive, 9.9 acres, 51 single-unit detached houses, maybe 18 lots for townhouses. They had 125 trees, significant trees on the property. There are 6 left, which is to say 5%. And the reason those 6 are left is that they're on the property line and they just couldn't get to them. So I think we definitely need a floor, and 5% I don't think is enough. If there's some way you could key tree preservation to whether people were actually going to build workforce housing or affordable housing. I don't know whether legally that's a feasible thing to do. But the reality is, right now, is that we're cutting down our trees to make it a little cheaper for rich people to move here. Why should we be doing that? So those are my 2 comments.
Thank you. Corey.
I just think we have to be careful with that comment, because every time we say that $5,000 doesn't make a difference on affordable housing, we've said that enough over the last 10 years, and now it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we have to be careful every time we say $5,000 doesn't make a difference on affordable housing.
I would also argue that there are rich people here that are moving here because it's very expensive where they live, and they can sell their house for twice as much as the house they could buy here. And the reason for that is we don't have enough houses. When you constrict supply and you have increased demand, the price of that supply will go up.
I know Covey had his hand up, but I also want to remind myself that Gina also did, so Covey.
So actually I had that hand raised a little while ago. Chris mentioned actually most of my question. I was just trying to understand
The order of things.
Yeah, because to me, mitigation is still an option. So I was trying to better understand Kathy's point earlier about if they're still required to mitigate, then it still applies to them. They're just using that option later down in the flow chart. And I think if I understand correctly, the purpose then to me is a little backwards, is the floor only applies to certain lot sizes. Is that a better way to put it?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to bring the smaller lot size question back to the group because we heard it come up several times, because smaller lots are harder to preserve trees. So that's why we started with, is there interest to exempt the smaller lots? If there is, do you still want them to mitigate? And then we can start talking about the larger ones. Larger meaning an acre or larger, or 2 acres or larger, whatever the group comes up with. Or we treat them all the same. I mean, that's another fair question too.
And I guess I'll just add one more point on that. I feel like there is another conversation going. So maybe I'll come back to the lot size question and yield over to the more
I just actually wanted to encourage the group not to wade into what is probably more of a political issue about the affordability of housing in this town. And I'd really like to just kind of keep the group focused on the trees because that's what we're here for. And I agree, I think, with everything that Kathy said, that basically we shouldn't outright exempt any parcel. Is there a ringing?
Yeah, there is a ring.
Sorry.
No, it's just you.
I'm emanating.
Of course.
Turn down your hearing aid.
Thank you.
Picking up everything.
I think there's a
There's
speaker
a
extra sensitive.
Just a
I don't think any parcels should be exempted based on size. I think even if it's a quarter acre, you can mitigate, or you might even, I mean, like as my day job, the Poplar Project, we saved trees and it was half an acre. I agree that the floor, I like the idea of having a floor, and I would support that on an acre or larger parcels. That said, in our urban core, you'll have parcels where, maybe that's where a 5-story building should go, and that should be multi-family housing, and maybe there is a large tree, but it doesn't make sense to save it because it's in the urban core. So I don't know what the solution is to that, but in those urban high-density areas, I would support an exemption from the floor requirement.
Kathy, noted, yes.
So just to get back to help explain my thought process on the smaller lots it's so much more expensive to develop a small project than a large project because of scale. And so if you have a property owner that owns an acre and goes to an artist says, what can I do here? It's a real disincentive to think that you have to save a whole bunch of trees, and it's easier to get the project to move forward if you realize, hey, maybe we can save some, but we don't necessarily have to save them, but you will have to mitigate them. And it's sort of more of a psychological barrier than an outright cost barrier. It's like, is this a feasible lot to develop or not? There's these. So that's where I'm coming from and in my experience. Now, that may not be valid, but that is my experience, is why I wanted to sort of throw it out there as a start for the conversation. And I'm thinking we're really trying to get that missing middle housing going, and it's the one that's not subsidized. And so those are the kinds of scale properties that could be ideal for that type of housing, and that's why I want to try to encourage it as much as possible. And so that's why I suggested what I did.
Yeah. Back to Gina real quick, and then over to Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I don't disagree with you, but I think Bend is a pretty hot real estate market, as they say, and so like adding on a tree requirement, like, developers still want to come here and make money. Like, they're still going to make money. So, like, I don't know. I'm not too opposed to the, to having the floor.
Well, so I gave some of you guys this. I crunched some numbers the other day just to give us some more things to talk about. And I apologize to Brett and Dan. This is something I did not send in electronic version. I'll send to Pauline later, so it goes into public commentary. But essentially what I did is I did some appraisal numbers. As in a consulting arborist, one of the things I do is I do appraisals. Appraisals are typically used to collect damages, insurance purposes, and even write off losses to the IRS. Thank you. So on the front page, I kind of talk about my process and talk about how appraisal works in general. On the second page here, and this is all kind of using our replacement costs right now. So as you know, essentially if you remove a tree from 6 to 9.9 inches, you replace it with one tree. 10 to 19.9 inches, you replace it with 2, and then 20 inches and up, you replace it with 4. So what I did is I did an appraisal for a 6-inch tree, a 9.9-inch tree, and then I kind of averaged it out. Then I did the same for that 10 to 19.9 replacement class, and then I averaged that out. And then I did the 20-inch replacement, which was just a straight up, just to capture some larger knowns to see what the numbers mean. I did a 25-inch, a 30-inch, and a 40-inch. If you look all the way to the right, you'll see that there's what's called a basic reproduction cost. That's just the basic, and actually let me backtrack for those who are watching, or Brett and Dan. Basically what this is a trunk formula method. So basically you're taking an evaluation of the cost to replace a small tree and you're extrapolating it to a larger tree. Because you can't, of course, go down to the nursery and buy a 30-inch tree. So that's roughly how this process works. I got the cost from Land Systems Nursery in town. That's $425 for a 3-inch ponderosa pine. And so on the far right for the 6-inch, for example, you can see that a 6-inch tree would actually be appraised at $1,700. I did add some depreciation because just like if you had a beater car and you hit someone, you want them to replace your car, you're not expecting to get a brand new car for it. There's going to be some depreciation for it. So the actually depreciated cost and the appraised value of that 6-inch tree would actually be $1,030. So long story short, the far right column is what's there. If you go to the second page on this, what I did is replacement tree cost. That would be basically for the bend cost. So let's say that average tree, we cut down a tree from 6 inches to 9.9 inches. That would roughly cost $637.50. I got to that. That includes the installation cost, and that's roughly 1.5 times the cost of the tree. That's kind of a rough way you can estimate the planting. So the average depreciated cost for that same tree is going to be an average within that class is going to be $1,810. So the city of Bend is essentially losing $1,172 for each plus 50 cents for each tree that is replaced. And you can see that goes on the way down. So the next column from 10 inches to 19.9 inches, Bend is essentially losing $5,125 and so on and so forth. And I put this together again, it's all kind of fuzzy math. It's quick numbers. When you're doing an actual tree appraisal, you look at that tree on site. But I just want to at least get some other numbers that we can look at to discuss. And I think while we're talking about loss of trees and the costs associated with doing tree preservation, I want to point out that there's also a huge amount of money being lost by the city of Bend and the citizens. Because trees, of course, don't only benefit just the people on that site, and it benefits the entire neighborhood and it benefits the entire city. And so just to have for more accounting, because again, at the end of the day, I think it all comes down to an accounting question. We're losing trees, but what is it going to cost the city? And what is it going to cost to replace that value? And so even though we have some of this mitigation in place, we're still losing money at the end of the day. And I wanted to point that out.
I wish you could share this with lenders so that they can take into account the actual value of the land when they're lending on construction there.
And it's tricky, yeah. And I think just like with capitalism, the money speaks loudest. So whenever we really want to get serious about talking about the values of trees, I think I always recommend appraisals because it very clearly puts out the valuation of trees in a monetary sense.
Thank you, Chris. So we've had some pretty healthy discussions so far. I wonder if there's a stomach among the group for us to go around and make some further commentary in the service of should we have an exemption? Should those be required to mitigate so we can continue to assemble the makings of a recommendation to council? Comfortable if we go around and talk about that? I mean, you've heard some opinions.
Can I ask about the floor? What does the floor mean? What are we talking about with the floor? Does that mean you cannot cut that under any circumstance kind of thing, or was that?
That was the idea. So instead of, I heard comments from this group through all our meetings that, we have that flow chart. What is going to stop someone from just going straight to clear cutting? Because I think a lot of developers may just go there because it's easier, maybe, or cheaper. So the idea was if we don't want the developments to just go straight to clear cutting, then you have a floor.
What if you don't? Maybe. What if you have like 10 trees on the site? Then how many would you have to keep in that case?
5%.
If we're talking about 5% as the floor.
And it's
so
yeah.
Is that 1 or 0?
It's the 25% requirement. Yeah.
We'd round up.
No, what would the floor, how would the floor be interpreted in that kind of situation?
Round up to 1.
I've been rounding up, but we round up in most things in the code. Yeah.
Otherwise that wouldn't be clear to developers. So we would have to, if the number is below what 5% would equal, we'd have to say in the code what that means.
And that's a level that you're not allowed to mitigate. You can't develop it. You got that tree in the way, you're done. That's what that means.
Well, I think the idea is you probably have a couple trees to choose from, and maybe most of them have to go, but one might not be.
I think that maybe for the smaller lot, this comes into play when you do have the 1 or 2 trees on the property, things like that. And I was just looking at some of these. There's a lot of parcels on the Daily Estate subdivision. They're an acre and a quarter. All of those properties are going to be redeveloped under these new code things. I'm assuming. a lot of them have 3 or 4 trees on the property. I think that size, that threshold of acre and a quarter is something that should be considered.
And are you saying then you'd recommend no floor also on the?
No, I'm not.
small size?
I think that is. I mean, if you're requiring mitigation, I don't know why. I mean, I guess yeah, we want to try to keep trees, but if there's one tree and you can't save it for some reason or another, I don't think anybody'd want to. I think it makes it so it would stop a project if it came up under this criteria. We can't predict what those things are going to be, but I think if there was a way to keep a tree that it's not in the way, somebody's obviously going to do that anyways, and it wouldn't matter if there's a floor or not. So
I don't know how big of a problem the floor would be. I have some theoretical discomfort with it just because I can imagine a site where it's 2 trees and they're both in the way of something, and then it would potentially prohibit it. Especially thinking about the smaller lots, that I think a half-acre lot to a 1-acre lot is more likely to be something where it's not a large developer. It might be a homeowner or a property owner or somebody who's newer to the development world who's trying to do a project which adds housing, right? And that gets back to what I said before about we tend to think about the home where I live or a giant subdivision, and there's so much of this that's at the small end. I'm curious how we'll find the right answer on the small lots.
you're right. Those type of projects are smaller developers that are not the people that have deep pockets, and the areas on the south part of town have a little bit bigger lots, residential lots that could be utilized for some of these new code things. Those are also served by Avion or Rhodes Water, or, where City of Bend is next to it. They all have to have 10-foot separation. Not only do they have Avion or Rhodes Water, a lot of those are providing irrigation water in a pipe as well. So those got to be 10-foot apart. And then your sewer's got to be 10-foot apart. Then you got to put in a dry well, and that's got to be clear of everything. So you run into a lot of conflicts.
And this is back. I'm saying it mainly to remind myself, but in case someone else has already forgotten, the House Bill 2001 enabling code things would be 0.6 of an acre, and you're going to put 3 or 4 units on it. That would not be subject to this code.
Right.
But if they were going to do land division or a cottage where they would be fee simple lots, be able to be sold individually, then that would be subject to this. If the lot size matched up and everything, because land division is one of the things that would.
Land division does, but we were looking, and I don't believe Senate Bill 458 does. So if you have your quadplex and you go through the middle housing land division, there's very little we can require of those. Okay. And so they wouldn't be subject to the tree preservation. So this is really larger developments that go through site plan review or your partition or land division.
Okay, because I think that's where my imaginary discomfort comes from, is those 2 things that we work so hard to have available to us for housing purposes. If those aren't even going to be subject to this, then a lot of my theoretical concern about the one tree that ruins a job probably goes away.
And the original direction from council was preserving larger trees on large sites, generally large. Southeast area plan, it has to be 2 acres or more, but we're not saying that's necessarily the right size citywide.
Okay, so I'll start off the round table since we're at this uncomfortable spot where we need to try to move things forward. So I'm gonna recommend that we exempt under an acre, and that mitigation would still be required, and that no floor under an acre. Yeah, let's go with that.
Mitigation for any size under an acre? As opposed to what Kathy was saying, getting mitigation from a half to.
No, I was saying.
In the end, I think hers was less than or equal to it.
Less than or equal to it.
Yeah, and I reserve the right to think about it as we go around the room. Normally I go last, but I thought I would go first. Covey, do you have a comment before we continue?
did.
Yeah,
Two things actually.
please.
One quick one was, I think when you're saying under, I think it should just be under an acre based on how Pauline has it. Doesn't include an acre.
Yes, less than, sorry, you're right, less than an acre.
Just to be
Yeah,
clear.
I said less than or equal to, but I mean less than.
I just wanted to share real quick because I took some of those numbers and just did percentages just from my personal kind of knowledge, and also wanted to share them real quick. So when you look at number of lots that are half acre or smaller, that's 73% of all lots. Half to one is 14%. So just between less than an acre would be 87% of all lots that are remaining in terms of number of lots. And then 1 to 2 is 7% and 2 plus is 6%. So that's all the, again, number of lots. And then I also did acres, and it's backwards.
Yeah.
So half acre or less is 10%, half to 1 acre is 7%, and then 1 to 2 is 6%, and then 2 plus acres is 76% of total acreage. So I just want to share that. And I guess my one question that I think would help me vote better or better understand is, I did also look at the DBH provided for the 8 developments. And I didn't necessarily see I don't know if there's always a correlation between acre size and number of trees on the acres, because it felt like it was very all over the place.
So it's just a random selection of 8 projects in the city.
From the different quadrants.
And is that about normal for all the lot sizes? Because I'm wondering why we're looking at lot sizes if the trees are not correlated to the lot sizes. Is that just in terms of development?
I think it's mainly because we think about there's a minute, like Kathy said, there's a minimum amount of effort that goes into any site. It's just like if we're building a 500 square foot home or a 4,000 square foot home, it has one foundation and one roof, right? No, and one kitchen, no matter what. So those are always costs that are built into it. So from a density standpoint, from a development standpoint, there's the size is impacted by the fact that you have to bring utilities to every site.
Yeah, I guess when I looked at that, I looked at Poplar has 715 on-site DBH, which is half acre, so that would be exempt.
So it's in a heavily wooded part of town versus Sky Vista, which is in the northeast, which is not so heavily wooded. And even though it's a much larger site, it had a lot less DBH per acre.
Yeah, I guess my concern is just if we're excluding 87% of lots, it's a little concerning. Especially if they're similar to Poplar, with it being small but still very heavily wooded.
Or excluding 15% of the acreage.
17.
Said differently. So I guess you're right. They're both relevant. The math is accurate. I think in the development world, we're looking at acreage because it's dwelling units per acre. That is the density calculation for adding housing, and I realize we're sort of talking in 2 different planes here, but.
And to clarify, we're still basically this is a way to talk about which lot size would be excluded from the floor, because we still haven't talked about whether or not they might still be required to mitigate if the group decides. I just wonder if, and especially I understand some concerns with having a floor that reduces flexibility, which we also wanted to have to some degree. I wonder if there's another option instead of a floor to just have even higher, kind of like increasing the mitigation even further below that percentage. So like it's 10 times more, or something along those lines. So there's still an option. It's just even less attractive.
Harder option.
Okay, not to complicate it more, but I just wanted to put that out there as another option.
Yeah, but that adds flexibility, even though it's.
I'm marinating. I'm noodling on that.
Yeah, Covey, I'm sorry. Can you say that one more time?
Sure. So I think one of the concerns I heard, and it might be a real concern, is having a floor could make it prohibitive to have developments that are necessary for certain sites where you just can't meet that floor.
Right.
We don't want to take away affordable housing, but is there a way to make it even exponentially
Less attractive to clear cut.
Exactly. So it's still possible, but it would just cost the mitigation side or the fee in lieu or the replacement options would increase even further than the 1-to whatever the ratios we've decided. Once you go beyond the floor.
If you didn't keep the floor.
Then the mitigation increases correspondingly.
Yeah.
This is doing that and this is doing that, right?
How do you say then that that's not adding significant cost to
Yeah.
housing?
I mean, I don't,
Remember, it's not supposed to be a punishment.
Yeah.
This is not the, incentive is different than a punishment, so that's a different line, but I would caution you to say, I mean, there's nothing wrong with development and putting in housing. The goal of this committee is to help have some standards that we currently don't have to how to preserve trees when it can be done. It isn't to punish people who are building houses who don't preserve trees and make them pay more than what is reasonable for the I get worried about things like appraisals. This isn't a taking. We're not doing things to get back the cost of trees for the city. It's to mitigate, and that's the concept of mitigation. It's a little bit different than either punishing a developer or getting the full cost. It's to mitigate. So I'm just trying to make sure that our framework here is legitimate legally.
But Kavi, are you, just so I understand, are you saying provide options? And one option is you can do a 5% floor, and if you don't want to do the 5% floor, then you can mitigate clear cut, just it would be a little bit higher mitigation requirements.
Well, I want to clarify. I feel like,
Yeah.
well, I actually want to clarify because I don't think I'm saying that either. If anything, I'm going the opposite direction of saying we're looking at a floor and I'm in support of that, but I also want to hear the concerns of not having a floor prohibited development completely, but we still want to prevent and preserve trees and prevent clear cutting where possible. And so I was thinking of another option to basically still allow development to go ahead. So I'm actually saying the opposite. I'm not saying we don't want development, but just make it still attractive to preserve trees in the first place, if possible.
but if you don't preserve trees, you mitigate at a higher rate than you would otherwise.
With that 5%.
For that 5%, because otherwise if you had a floor, you just had to do 5%.
So I mean, it's a little bit like me telling my kids, I'm taking the PS4 away so that you have a greater exposure to literacy because you get to read during. That's not exactly how they would interpret it, and I don't think that's how housing developers would interpret that either.
I encourage you, I thought Gina had a really good point about the kind of development. So if it's the urban core and multifamily in the urban core, which is something that council is really supportive of. In certain parts of town, there is kinds of development that we really need. That might be the kind of development that you really need to not preserve anything and replant and revegetate. And we don't want to make that more expensive or unsustainable. Like, I would encourage you to not necessarily look at the city as one type of zoning and one type of development. That does get more complicated, but if you give us some policy objectives, then it's our role as staff to draft that.
Would it be okay for us, would we be not abdicating our responsibilities to say where we would like the planning commission and the council and staff to consider where there are particular housing priorities or particular complexities to offer something different than a floor? Or do we need to come with, because the technical nature of industrial, but not if it's housing, and urban core, but not urban single-family detached under or over a certain size, we start to that we're now in 5-dimensional chess, and we're barely able to understand what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I think if you can be clear with us what it is that you're trying to achieve.
And if you feel constrained by the way we've posed the questions and you have a different way you want to express, we could take that in and work with it. We just want to hear from you.
Chris?
Yeah, and so one of the reasons why I brought the appraisal numbers out, it's not a punitive thing, it's a real life valuation of the trees. And so I think if we're changing the valuation of the trees, say, oh, because you remove this, now we're going to jack it up, that's not as objective. I think it's, I'm not trying to make this a punitive thing as a developers, but I'm just showing the real costs that are associated when you remove a bunch of trees. and we're literally cutting their nose to spite our face. I think there's had a public outcry about the loss of trees, and it's a warm and fuzzy feeling when we're sitting underneath a tree. But intrinsic value doesn't hold a lot of value. But when you put numbers on it, that's the whole point of this, is to show the monetary values that are being lost when you're doing trees. So it's not a punitive thing, but I think it does need to stay as objective as possible so we can have a reasonable conversation about it. So at least we can be realistic about the value. So if we're offsetting the home costs, or things are going to cost more if we have to do more tree preservation, but this is what we're saving if we actually keep the trees. We are saving a value. And that's what I wanted to highlight, is that the trees are valuable. And this is a very low value, the numbers I have in here, because these don't talk about the ecosystem services. They don't talk about the time that it takes to plant the trees or remove them or keep irrigation. So these are all low numbers in here.
I'm gonna go Karen, Jim, Covey.
One thing we haven't talked about is whose design is going to control. In other words, you have a lot and the developer's design, what he wants to put in, would result in every tree being removed. But there's an alternative design perhaps that would give him the same density in housing, but for whatever reason he doesn't want to do it. Could the city, and some cities do, have a requirement that the city itself has some say in the design to preserve some trees? In other words, you want a certain density, we want you to preserve a tree, use this design.
5 years. Design and planning is not an optimum thing.
Love you, Karen, but I'm gonna leave. So to your point, can we carve out the BCD? Can we carve out, the elbow, whatever it might be? It is I mean, that is maybe even 6-dimensional chess. But to your point, city wants the BCD to get developed. And if trees are in the way, it's not going to get developed. Is there, do you see a way that we could do, or that staff can write a code that could carve out and create exceptions?
I mean, if there's a rational relationship to policy objectives, that's this type of code. First, it has to be clear and objective, so everybody has to know what we're saying. And then second, if there's a policy objective, the test is that it's got to be rationally related to what we're trying to do.
Right.
So we can't treat one area different for just some reason that doesn't make sense. So whether it's an area like the BCD or whether it's a type of development that we want to encourage in certain areas of town, those could be reasonable policy objectives. And I think based on some evidence in the record as to why it's hard to preserve in those areas. I mean, that's what we want to hear from those of you that do development, like why would it be harder with that kind of development to not have the percentages that this group is proposing? Like, why can't they?
Yeah, so if you had like a 2-acre lot and you could put, it's RH and you could put 54 units or something like that on it. And there was 4 trees on that lot and there was a floor. And so you had to save at least one or something like that. You could pretty easily look at that site plan and say, based on contours, emergency exits, where your building paths could go. It's the only way to save that tree is to lose 8 units or something like that. As long as there was a way to say, just everybody at the table agreed and said, yeah, there's no way to do this. There's no way to design this. There's no way to do it. And we're putting housing as a priority. There's got to be something written so that all trees would have to go in that scenario.
Well, I wonder, two thoughts. On the Bend Central District, I've done a couple code updates, and back in the day when there was parking was one of them. And then the most recent one, I think, with accessibility, we've looked at the lot sizes there, and they're like 10,000, 20,000. So if we did an exemption of an acre or less, I mean, you basically have taken the Bend Central District out of these requirements. And then when it gets to density, I'm just thinking this, I don't know. So in the RH, we want the 43 units to the acre. We don't want one tree to knock off 6 units. So do you put in something that if you are within 5% of the maximum density, you can clear cut if it means getting within 5% of the density?
Makes sense.
Dan's got his hand raised. Dan.
Well, interesting conversation. And it's kind of that question number 2, is there an absolute minimum that must be preserved? Is that the right question? Or we should be asking another question that started to a little bit be discussed. So if you can't meet tree preservation standards, rather than a floor, should there be a requirement to seek a variance? And in seeking that variance, or to apply for that variance, there number 1 needs to be a tree plan. And so that tree plan is submitted. Then there needs to be a site plan. And then there is a requirement for a narrative of why those trees are removed, or which trees are removed and why they're removed, whether it's grading, whether it's utilities, whether it's density, so that planning staff can clearly see why those trees are being removed based on all the requirements, and then make their determination. So mitigation just isn't something that you can accept if you would like to. It has to be something that goes through a very clear procedure of a tree plan and of a development plan and a narrative that's clearly written for staff to review it and make a determination. So that would be perhaps a proposal to consider. And then you would not have the floor on that. So that would do away with the floor.
Thank you, Dan. We're all absorbing the thought because it's kind of a new angle. I'm going to go to Chris and then Morgan.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think a little bit to Karen's point too. It's I think ultimately we'd love to, in a perfect world, as I mentioned before, it all comes down to the design. It's got to be, tree preservation has to come in the design phase. And Dan's nodding his head on that. Because after that, it's very little you can do once the roads are in. And so I think making a tree-friendly design, and really what we're trying to encourage is developers to design around the trees for preservation. But I think it's, to Karen's point too, it's going to be very hard if a developer comes back and says, hey, I can't do this because of my design. And who in the office for the city is going to say, oh, call them out on that. I think if we have or help them along the way, maybe it's a better path, trying to help them towards more of a tree-friendly design. And I think having an urban forester or someone, an arborist on staff, and I'm sorry I've said this every meeting, but would really help along the process.
It's a dream to get viewers online.
Yeah, just last time on the trip. And then what was my other thought I had? Oh, and I think one third option that hasn't been, I think it's been brought up before, but because of the restriction with code, because of stormwater, because of size of things, I'm wondering if there's any space in here that we can have alterations or exemptions from some code to allow for tree preservation. If it is proved that you can't preserve this amount of trees because of, let's say, street width or sidewalk width or things like that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely on our asterisk for the city engineering standards part, which is how can we, use that as evidence to get different standards as part of that discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, Morgan, and then I'll figure out that. Do you have
on Chris's, because I was thinking the same thing that Chris said. There's more than just engineering standards too. There's there's setback standards, and there's other things like that.
Planning,
to help. I mean, if it's like tree versus like meeting, having an 8-foot setback instead of a 10-foot setback, it's like, well, let's save the tree.
And those incentives will be included for setbacks and what is in the code today.
Yeah. And I think like stormwater management has been discussed. Like trees provide a huge amount of stormwater management. They're underground soil systems that can both help larger trees grow, but also can help with stormwater management. So I think there's a lot of crossover. And I think the engineers can work with arborists. That's where a lot of magic can happen. And so I don't know what needs to happen but that'd be beneficial.
It's in our list. It's just outside our specific scope. So.
Yeah. it's tough though, because I feel like a lot of these things could be.
Well,
'cause
this is version one of this is
Yeah.
the recommendation. It will become version one of the code, and then it will get, reviewed and updated in the coming code cycles too. So I want everybody to remember that, like we're recommending what will become the first version, but then once there's actual data of applications submitted to whatever standards get adopted, then there's real data for our successors at the next TRUAC to consider.
Or like, not the next track, but.
Sorry.
I just want to be clear.
That's on the agenda for meeting 52.
So what Jeff, I think, meant to say is that, like with accessory dwelling units, when I started here in 2015, we wrote a code, we made it easier to do accessory dwelling units. And then we saw that there was still some issues or barriers to developing them. And so we would revisit it and amend the code based on the feedback we were getting. So that we're going to do the same thing as we do with any code update, especially like a tree preservation one. If we realize, let's say we have a floor of 2 acres and that is just too small or too large, then, and based on the feedback we're getting and the issues we're seeing, we can change that with future code updates. We just need to get something on the books and then try it.
Have to start operating something. I lost track of order after.
I was going to go on to Dan's comment here. So I think just to bring us back to the original council direction, the other half of which was to not impede needed housing. So I just want to note that if we can create a code that meets what the city's density desires are, then adding a variance feels a little unreasonable and costly. So it does seem like if we can focus on how to arrive at the density goals that the city wants and the development goals in the areas that the city wants, then we should try to do that via code rather than adding another permit process.
Yeah, just on that, people often talk about variances, and as Morgan just said, a variance is a separate process, and actually our variance process in our code says it can't result in the removal of significant trees. So to have a variance, it would be complicated to draft into the variance code. What I hear, the idea is more a discretionary track where there's a provision. So I think we can figure out how to draft the idea. It's a good idea on how do you give flexibility outside of the clear and objective. It's the discretionary track. So if what you want is a standard and then an ability to apply discretion, which I joke is like, let us use our brains, then you need to give us a discretionary track. And that's what we have to put into the code to modify the clear and objective standard. And that would go right into the tree preservation code rather than a separate variance permit, which is complicated and not really the right tool. But the idea is fine.
Excuse my lack of proper term. And then it would be expedited if development would go ahead and meet the code, then it would expedite and they would go through the whole process very efficiently, or they could seek the discretionary if they elect to. So it gives them a choice.
Yeah.
Got it. Kathy.
Just want to second that discretionary as opposed to going through variance. Variances are just, it adds a whole other layer.
Okay.
And, but if we can provide that flexibility with it, we either do X, Y, and Z, or we have some discretion. It is the most flexible way of dealing with the fact that every lot's unique.
There were some hands on the corner here. Did everybody get heard one way or the other? Corey, then Covey.
Yeah, well, to keep it short, I'll just echo what Morgan said. Definitely adds costs and delays the process. So, I know council asked us to save trees, but also wants affordable housing and housing faster, and nothing we're doing so far today has helped that.
Maybe to clarify Mary's point, this would be an application that already has a tree map and a site plan, and there would be an alternative track instead, that's the discretionary track if the applicant says this doesn't quite, the process that is in the code doesn't quite work for us. That alternate track would be then it's essentially working with staff to figure out something that would get approved. Or am I
Yeah, I mean,
opening
that's
another?
essentially what we do now, and we've seen the result. So, I mean, it's very subjective right now.
Well, I think it would be more specific, but I'm thinking not like what we do now. It would be more, you have these criteria. There's this one criteria of the 5% floor, for example, or what.
Yeah.
If you'd want to not apply, then you have to do, not anything goes, but then I think what he was suggesting is you have to have a tree plan that you would have to then have specific things that you had to do within that discretion. That's what I was
Yeah,
hearing, within
okay,
that
okay.
discretionary track. Here's what you have to meet to comply with it.
Yeah, like when we have discretionary tracks right now, when we have one, for example, for access, you want to use the alley or the street. And we put in there, you can apply for a discretionary track because maybe there's a topography issue or a rock outcropping. I would have to really think about what the standards would be. Like maybe it's you can't get to the 5% of your maximum density or something that if you're going to apply for discretion, why? And do you meet the why?
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
And then I think we could make the objective parts of this code even more simple because we've been trying to build in all the scenarios and keep it objective. But if the group ultimately wants an opt out of the floor and that's just go the discretionary track, then we can probably keep some of these other aspects more simple.
And then if you go the discretionary track, you still have to mitigate.
I'm sorry, Polly, did you say apply for the discretionary track?
Yeah, if a developer applies for the discretion. So when you apply for, let's say, a land division and you want to go through a discretionary track and you have housing that's part of your development, you have to state in your application narrative that you're providing needed housing and you want to go through a discretionary track and you are not going to go through the clear and objective.
Can that application be denied?
I imagine it can.
If the criteria can't be met.
I guess that makes me really queasy just because if the whole point of building in the discretionary track was to, we all talked about
Right.
wanting to provide options. So if there is the possibility of a denial of the discretionary track, then we need 15 more meetings.
Let me add a little, just, I guess, practical clarity to what could happen there. So what we're doing through the needed housing statute is we're looking through all sections of our code and creating a clear and objective track and a discretionary track. It's just for housing. Either one of them, whenever a developer chooses to go on, most of the time they're approved because we are able to meet the criteria of approval. But regardless of whether they take a discretionary track or a clear and objective track, they both could be denied if they don't meet the criteria of approval. But it has to be tied back to a criterion. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden the city gets to have an incredible amount of discretion that they normally wouldn't have otherwise have had to say, we just don't even like the idea of the project, so we're going to deny it. It still needs to go back to whether or not they meet the criteria, whether the criteria are clear and objective or the discretionary criteria. There will be criteria. It's just that with the discretionary one, you just can consider more factors. And there's usually brain a little bit
Yeah, a
more.
little bit, and it's their choice. And often developers don't like things. I mean, cities are kind of going to clear and objective because it's the safest path, but sometimes the developers are finding they're more rigid and they don't like it. They want a discretionary track that gives some other criteria where you're allowed, honestly, to negotiate a little bit. So I'm finding, reading the cases from other cities, they're liking a discretionary track as well.
Well, that's a whole other can of worms. I promised Covey next, and then we'll come over here.
All right, I had a couple of things I wanted to share. First, I just want to mention, I don't think I've shared this before in this committee. I feel like I'm always on the side of preserving trees, of course. But I don't know if this is true, but I think I might be one of the only members here who is currently renting and not owning. And I had actually earlier applied for a rooted homes home as well earlier this year. So I definitely understand the affordable housing crisis and the need for that. I just wanted to personally share that as well. I do want to raise a couple points. So one of Chris's points in terms of especially the value and kind of putting a value on the trees. I still want to mention, so at least from my perspective, the community as a whole cares about preserving large trees, and council, that's one of the reasons why this committee exists. And so if I understand so far, what we were saying is that for development, it would be 20% of priority trees, so larger than 20 inches. is what we're trying to say as the first step in the flow chart. The second step is 25% of DBH. Then there's 2 mitigation options, tree replacement or fee in lieu. So those are all the options that are available for every project that developers always have for every project. If we did the 5% floor, we're still considering potentially excluding small lot sizes, which we can decide as a committee what that number is. And then the only thing those small properties would be excluded from is that floor itself, which could be prohibitive for really small lot sizes. That's one of the things we're talking about. And then we might also have now a discretionary path as well for that floor specifically is potentially what we're also considering as one other option. So I feel like there's a lot of options that we're putting, and all the time this code is basically saying for any development, they're able to cut 80% of all trees that are larger than 20 inches. They're able to cut all the trees smaller than 20 inches. And that's all okay with the code. If they're not able to do that, and all the trees that are being cut down have a value to the community, to the city, to all of us, and to the people living there. I talked about wanting to be able to live and purchase land in Bend, but I feel like for me at least, and I don't know if this is shared, I also want to do that in a city where there's trees. And so I think there's a affordable housing side, but there's also I want to still be able to buy a property and live in a place that still has trees and not just housing without any trees. So I just want to say that if you're saying that we're allowing the 20% priority trees as one option, and then we have all these other options, I feel like there's still a lot of room to still be able to do affordable housing and be able to choose what works best for each lot. So I feel like developers still have that flexibility that's inbuilt. So I guess I'm just, I feel like a floor is helpful and necessary because we're talking about 5% of trees on a total lot. Sorry, back to you.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah, I'm still back and forth on the floor. I think the one thing it seems like this committee has agreed on the whole is the flexibility, having the ability to, because again, I've worked with developers. I'm, by and large for tree preservation, but I'm also a realist and also, as a consultant, I try to be as objective as possible. And I've definitely seen lots that are very difficult, and it's quite often it's very, if not impossible, very difficult to preserve trees. And I'd rather see trees preserved in a correct way versus kind of forced in. And so I think having a floor is can be tricky that way. I think it does could force poor tree preservation, which is just going to be down the road. You're going to have to remove that tree in a few years anyways. And, I think when we talked about we're looking at a lot of sticks right now in terms of stick and the carrot approach. I don't personally think they're necessarily sticks. I think we're just trying to put I'm trying to show here that there is value in trees. And hopefully we're just at least appreciating that value and representing that. But I'm wondering if we can more talk about a carrot. I think one thing that a lot of folks are interested in before, or instead of talking about a floor, maybe talk about a ceiling. So maybe I think Maureen and Corey had mentioned that they like the idea of maybe an expedited process if they do things well. So what if we have kind of a ceiling where if developers meet that 20% or maybe even greater, that they get an expedited process versus, we slow down the process if you go through that variance where you're meeting underneath that 5%, but instead if you're meeting some of these goals and you're preserving the trees as the city has setting this goal by putting this committee together, they're trying to preserve trees. And if developers can work within those and meet those city goals, then they get rewarded for that. So again, I don't think it's necessarily a stick, but what if we approach it more in that carrot? Yeah. I don't know what people think about that.
Well, the expedited process has come up in meetings in the past, and that could be maybe part of your wish list, but I'm not sure it's really possible with this code update, just to be upfront.
Yeah, we talked about before, our other projects we expedite are very discreet and recognizable from the day they come in across the counter. This one would require some review, and we wouldn't know exactly how that would fit in with, like, we expedite affordable housing right now. So that already puts other projects at the back of the line. So if we're stacking more and more expedited projects, I get concerned about what's left.
That topic bridges multiple different permitting functions that the city has. And so in expedited review, as Renee states, we offer it for one type of development, that's affordable housing. That is true affordable housing that gets authorization essentially from our housing department as affordable. And what expedited means is that you get to the front of the line, which means that everybody who's been waiting in line is now behind you. And so we can only offer that incentive to a discrete number of units. In fact, right now, we've got more affordable housing projects going through than we've seen in quite some time, and it is gumming up the works for our normal process of town. It's all great and for good development to have, but it has sort of back of the house implications on just the normal amount of development. And we hear this from other committees that have been put together for other objectives, council objectives, and lots of attention gets put into affordable housing. And so it's not unusual for to be looked at as an incentive. It's just that we just don't have the ability to make everybody expedited. Everybody's expedited and nobody's expedited.
Our objective is to make these standards clear and objective and hopefully save time in the process in that way too. So that's a major goal of this committee's work.
I'm gonna go to Karen.
I'm not sure what a discretionary standard is. Does it have its own standards, or can a developer say, I want to cut down every tree, let's go the discretionary route so I can do it?
No.
I mean, how does it work?
So we would have to, and I already have a note, I'd have to look, see if other cities are going that route right now with trees, but we'd have to come up with some type of standards to say why it's okay for them to cut down those trees. What that looks like, I'm not sure yet, because
Obstacles that they can't work around. So that's the criteria we'd have to think about is
To be eligible for that track, period.
Right.
And then once you're in
Something
that track,
unique.
then that's when
It shows that you meet it.
it's the
Yeah.
give and take. Okay. So I think we're at a spot where I want to reorder things and ask the first question of, should we have a floor, yes or no? So I can try to understand some consensus here, because if we get to that spot, then we can talk about, should we exempt a size? And if so, what one? I'm going to push the group here, trying to get to something we can write down in pencil. Question clear?
Yep.
It is the one question.
Yes or
All right,
no.
Morgan.
Should be yes or no, yeah.
Floor, yes or no?
No.
And you're saying, okay, no.
I
It's
mean,
uncomfortable, isn't
It's
it?
terrible. I'm sort of right on the edge. I'll just say no.
can I just add, Morgan and Kathy, so if we said, would there be the option they can do a discretionary path if they don't want to do the floor?
Then I would be more likely to have a floor, but not for the acre or.
Right, that'll be our next question, but.
If there was an alternative to get around it, then I would be more willing to say the floor.
Because if we can come up with those standards under the discretionary path, that would make sense for a developer not to do the 5% because they really can't, they would go through the discretionary path.
Right, but just the way that Jeff phrased the question, I just want to make sure that.
I'd be happy to rephrase the
No.
question based on Pauline's.
Well,
input, too.
we're starting with the yes, no, in order to talk about whether or not we're even going to talk about lot size at all, right?
That is the second question.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll come back on it.
Can we do A and B, like a discretionary track, I mean,
Floor options.
for in any scenario? Well, straw poll, if there was a discretionary track to be determined, straw poll. So they answer both questions so that we can get something done.
Yeah, I agree. So let's go that way, because what happened last time with the tree ratios was we confused ourselves a little bit, and then there was a little bit of revision midstream that we'll talk about before we adjourn. So I'm going to ask you a yes or no on two questions. I've just decided all on my own. Is a floor yes or no, and then a discretionary path of any kind TBD. Squishy enough? All right, Mary says yes. So, she's not voting. And Morgan, floor?
No, and the next question is discretionary path?
Discretionary path,
Yes.
yes.
A floor, yes, and a discretionary path, yes. But no floor for acre below.
We're not there yet.
We will get to
Okay.
size. Does the floor apply, will be the next
Okay.
question.
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes. Corey?
No, but yes if yes.
No.
Get it. Yes, discretion, if the group decides there should be a floor, then he wants a discretionary path.
I would be fine with the floor if we had a discussion.
Yeah.
Oh, so,
And his vote is no for floor.
Covey?
So yes, for the floor, and for the discretionary path, that's only for the floor?
If a floor is established.
If a floor
Okay.
is established, we like to see a
Covey's good at clarifying.
Mr. Clarifying question. Love it. Thank you. Manoj?
Yes, yes.
Oh, wait, was your vote yes on
Yes
discretion?
and yes.
Sorry, I missed that.
No, yes.
No, yes. You guys are moving faster than I can write. Good job. Sarah, do you wish to express an opinion?
My opinion is yes and yes.
Excellent.
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes.
Thank you, Chris. Brett?
Yes and yes.
And Dan?
Yes and yes.
I'm going to vote no and yes if yes. Sometimes I forget to vote. That is definitely, so basically everybody says that there should be some sort of discretionary path, and there's a significant majority that are saying, yes, there should be a floor. So then the next question as we go around the room is going to be, is there a site size that should be exempt from that floor? And if so, what is that size? Does that sound like fun? Sound like a fun game? We're gonna keep going in the same direction so Jeff can remember what order we're going in.
I'm trying to take notes here too. So the question is, sorry,
The size.
the size
That would not.
that would not be subject to standards at all. Or that
Can we clarify that?
To the floor.
Not
not
subject to the
subject to the
floor?
floor. Okay.
Is that the question?
Okay.
That's what you meant,
Right,
right?
lot
Not
size.
subject, the question
not
is there a
subject
site
to the
size that
floor.
should not be subject to the floor?
Got it.
Not that is exempt from code altogether.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if I can just put that reminder again, so 73% of lots are less than an acre, half an acre.
We'll go to the stats. Let's go to the stats team first.
And 14% are half to 1 acre. So the total combined between those two is 87%
You
of
decided to go
lots.
you decided to go percentage of lots.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
I'll,
the acreage doesn't correlate
it
to
equates to
trees,
units,
so.
it equates to housing units though. If it was if we were only single family per lot, then it would be much more equivalent. But because you get more, you have
Units.
larger lots on the right hand end that yields more housing. So arguably, it's more flexible from a site design standpoint. It's always going through master plan or some kind of big subdivision versus a small lot that might go from 0 to 2 units. Are we back on a different plane again?
Would it also be easier if you set some parameters for the voting because you've got so many options up there? Should it be less than 2 acres? Should it be less than 1 acre? Should it be less than half?
I think we're trying to get an idea
If
of,
there's a sense at all.
yeah, if there's a sense, and if so, what that is.
So
and
it's
then
either a half,
we'll-
1 or 2.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that to follow up on Manoj's question, not all lots are the same. We know that from both a tree standpoint and from a development standpoint. And so, yes, 87% of the lots are under 1 acre. But the percentage of total acreage is far skewed into the larger lots that remain that are undeveloped, according to this data. And so the total land available to be used by this code is skewed into the larger parcels. The significant majority of actual parcels is skewed to the small.
Because we haven't done a tree inventory, we don't know.
Yeah,
whether
and they're in
the
all
trees
four
are more on the
quadrants
larger
where
lots and
parts of them
smaller
it's
lots,
heavily
we don't
wooded and
know.
parts of them it's sparsely wooded too. So,
But is it fair?
If I could just,
Yeah.
we're just talking about it in terms of like flexibility, right? So like a half acre lot, you have less flexibility. An acre, you have a little bit more than an acre, you have more.
But is it, can I ask another clarifying question on that? So is it fair to say that this code is going to be applied at the time of the site plan review, or there's an application that's done at that time? So is it fair to say that it would not apply to 87% of applications, or is that not correct? If the lots.
These are, well, one, it's just the vacant properties in town. This isn't all the property. There's redevelopment, there's addition. I mean, there's a lot of different types of development that
But
can
the
come
tree,
into play.
this would only apply to the new
Vacant properties.
vacant properties. Okay.
Do we know, Pauline, whether the way these lots are owned, any would be master planned? If they're,
Master plan is 20 acres or larger, and these are.
unless they're in ownership.
In common ownership, yeah,
Common
that's why
ownership. Do
it's.
we know about the ownership
a lot of-
patterns to know?
I'm
how
trying to
that
think of
equates?
where in
So-
the town
So
that's 20
we're not
acres.
sure that
Okay.
that equates one to one.
does everyone feel comfortable with the information that's provided here? It's both a parcel count by size range and also an acreage. And I guess this is super helpful information for you to have broken it down in a percentages way. I guess use whatever information you feel is most relevant, because we're still trying to get an idea of, do you care about the lot size with regard to an exemption from the floor? And if so, what is that size? That's the question I'm going to go around the room for.
And these lots are only vacant lots. There's a lot of developable properties in town that I have a house on them. So
Yeah, like
there's a huge number
Yeah,
of
yeah.
them.
So again, this is the best available quick term data we could get. And it excludes a fair amount of information that could also be relevant.
Could I ask a very quick clarifying question on this though? So basically we're already saying there is going to be a discretionary path, but this would exclude smaller lot sizes than half acre or 1 acre or whatever is decided from having to even go through a discretionary path at all. So it's multiple, basically it's excluding all of that.
Yeah,
and
because
then-
the discretionary path would be applied to the floor, anything exempt from the floor would not essentially be eligible for
and we,
the discretion.
I guess I'm just considering, is that still necessary now that there is a discretionary path? Because it feels like it already provides
Yeah,
some
because the
flexibility.
discretionary path is going to add a little bit of cost. You're going to have to put some sort of effort into it. So then is there a size that below which that is diminishing returns for our housing needs?
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Good discussion. All right, Morgan, the question is there a site size? And if so, what size?
Thank you. Taking into account, every lot is different, taking into account how little buildable land there is left after you put in Kathy's fire turnaround and stormwater, et cetera, I would like to apply this to all lots under 2 acres.
Okay. Kathy.
I would like to say 1 acre and below. I know that it got brought up of we saying less than an acre. Honestly, the way lots are platted, these older plats, they did it by acre, so I would say 1 acre and less.
So less than or equal to 1 acre.
Correct.
All these will be that way.
Okay.
It's just easier to.
Okay. But we're being specific about it so that we
Yeah, I don't want a
have-
poor property owner has exactly 1 acre.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, Gina.
Oh, it's tough, because, so Poplar is half an acre, but we probably only really disturbed
60%.
60% of that. And we fit 7 houses and 6 parking spaces and bike parking and central courtyard and a trash enclosure
And
and
stormwater.
Well, that's under.
Both private and right of way.
Well, they did build a street for that project though, right? So,
Sidewalk,
but not,
sidewalk,
none of that property went to right of way though.
sorry?
None of that property went to public right of way.
Dedicate.
No, it had already, no, the right of way was already existing, yeah. so it's half an acre. Yeah, so, I kind of feel like half an acre. And I think if the discretionary path is there, then,
Okay.
I have that down.
Got it.
I think the discretionary path is going to have to be used a lot on the smaller properties. And I think it's going to cause more administrative burden on staff, which they don't need. And so I think we eliminate that and say it should not be required under 2 acres.
And are you saying if that exists, then there's no need for a discretionary path?
I'm saying, well, if you have a minimum floor, right?
But,
No, I'm
but
just saying.
2.1 acres would
True.
still be eligible for a discretionary path.
Right.
Or they say 5%.
Right. Unless they say 5%.
I feel like with my little knowledge, I'll say half an acre.
Manoj, put you on the spot.
Under an acre, or an acre less.
1 acre or less.
Eric?
2 acres or less. And so are we going ahead with you're talking about discretionary path. Are we in fact having a 5% minimum for trees that must be retained on a sign? Is that what we voted for?
So it's either.
That was the consensus, the significant majority.
Okay.
Enough to have a floor and a recommendation.
Yeah.
Sarah?
I don't think all of the fire turnaround infrastructure is often required on the smaller lots, like half acre. There might be circumstances, but I think it's less frequent. And since this wouldn't apply to quadplexes unless or middle housing land divisions, I think it's fair that the under an acre or half acre or less requirements are still not going to apply to a lot of developments. So I think half acre with the option, a discretionary track.
Discretionary half acre. Okay. Karen?
I don't think we should exempt any of them because each lot is different. Like our house is 1.8 acres. But if you were to take it down and put in, say, a fourplex, we have 3 huge ponderosas sitting right on the property line. And so that lot would meet all the standards. I think the lots are so different, so I don't think we should exempt any of them.
Noted.
No,
Noted.
no exemptions.
Got it.
Yeah, I don't think any exemptions. I see a death by 1,000 cuts happening in terms of loss of tree canopy. And again, when I appraise a tree, I don't appraise it differently if it's on half a lot versus on a 2 acre lot. Still worth the same amount.
Okay.
Sorry, Jeff, could I change my vote to also no exemptions?
Just no.
No.
This sold me.
All right.
I will as well, Jeff.
Okay.
Manoj, too?
Can I change my opinion?
Your vote?
I'm a non-voting member.
Yes, right.
So just my opinion.
Just so we would like to change your opinion
I'm going to
to
change my opinion to
to
no
no
exemptions.
exemptions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hadn't
Noted.
occurred to me.
I have your line sort of circled.
Yeah. Asterisk.
Online, Brett?
No exemption.
And then Dan?
I'll go with half acre. In just FYI, it seems like the majority of codes in Oregon are 20,000 square feet, which is essentially half an acre. So that's a fairly common standard among tree codes.
Thank you. I'm going to say I would like an exemption. I agree with less than or equal to 1 acre. So,
5 zeros.
Yep.
That's the majority. The rest are
we have,
spread.
How many are 1 and 2?
Yeah.
How many are 1 and 2?
yeah, we're tallying that now. I was just going to say, so we had, there were
3 at 2.
Yeah.
3 at 1.
3 at 1.
And then
2.5. So yeah.
Well, less than or one is less than or equal to 2.
Right.
I mean, if we were doing the cumulative,
Yeah, exactly.
the did I have that right? We had 3 at less than or equal to 2, 3 at less than or equal to 1, and 2.5 acre.
That's my.
So what does that mean?
What does that mean?
So if you wanted to revisit those who said
Yeah.
something other than 0.
We have
And try to agree
a
on
sizable
some
majority
size.
on yes to a site, and the big break is between 1 and 2, where we have essentially a tie.
So would the people, this is what council would do with the people that are at 1 and 2, be willing to compromise at 1?
Right.
Or do the ones at 1 want to go up to 2 to have a majority? That's the discussion those of you in that camp could have.
Or I guess the people who said no exemptions going to half as another option. Just to put it out there.
It's true.
Yes, that's true. So
What if us at 2 go down to 1 acre, but remove the discretionary track?
you want to remove the
Discretionary track and the floor. So at 1 or below, you're exempt entirely.
And then everything above is required to do.
The 5% floor and the discretionary, and the option of the discretionary track.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so,
No, that makes more sense.
okay, so.
Sounded like you were getting rid of the discretionary track for everybody.
At 1 acre or below, we essentially copy Corey's proposal to eliminate both the floor requirement and the requirement to use the discretionary track. You eliminate the choice entirely, and 1 or below is exempt.
That's what we were just voting
no
on.
Yeah.
floor.
That's what we were just voting on.
But no discretionary track either.
Well, the discretionary track is only for the
They
floor.
were exempt.
If it's
Yeah.
exempt,
The vote
it was
was
exempt.
2 acres, 1 acre,
Not
half
like,
acre.
not
You're just
required to have a floor at all.
Right.
Or discretionary. Yeah.
Or discretionary?
Yeah.
Right.
it was
Nothing to
just-
apply
it was just
discretion to.
Nothing to
Yeah.
apply
Just exempt.
discretionary to.
It's only for the
If it's
floor.
exempt, it's exempt.
So I'm sorry, I'm not saying this correctly. Okay, I'm gonna think through how to articulate this better.
So you want to go around and ask if the people who were a half or
Yeah.
1 or 2, if they would agree?
Yeah.
Something else.
Let's see. Eric and Corey, any interest in 1 acre?
I would go to 1 acre, yeah.
Colin.
Sorry, I wrote this down in order of going around the room.
And Morgan was at 2 acres as well.
She's reformulating her
I got it. That's right.
question.
So would you go to 1?
So if we go to 1, yeah, then at 2, we're still
At
proposing
1.1, you would
Yeah,
be
the-
subject to
the
the
5%
5.
floor.
1.01, you'd
Or
be
discretion.
subject to
Or
the
the
5%
Or
or the discretionary track.
So did you go to 1?
go to 1. Yeah, yeah.
So I think, just, but out of respect for Covey's good question, which is, does anyone on the know want to go to half?
Is the one leading right now?
Yeah, one is up to 6. So
Yeah.
we would need to get everybody who recommended no to go to yes and a half an acre to, so maybe, I don't know if that, you want to
Well-
caucus a little bit, we could.
Yeah, you're right.
And to clarify, half to 1 would still have a discretionary track if they can't. use
Yeah,
5%
anything
floor.
that's not exempted would be subject to would be eligible
Yeah.
to request the discretionary track at the 5% floor. Just like any property that had a 5% floor that wanted to
And you,
talk about
just to
the
make
discretion.
sure I have a good understanding, you mentioned, Jeff, that there's some costs or there's some work to go the discretionary track. Is it, just to have some idea of that, can you Do you know what that would be for a property of half acre to an
I
acre?
think until the standards were written by staff, it would be hard to, but like in general terms, the other stuff, other types of code things where there's a discretionary path, you essentially have to bring evidence and some alternatives. You have to propose something which requires that you've already done a drawing that says, oh shoot, we can't meet the 5%. So then you go make another set of drawings and analysis related to your proposal, and then a narrative and usually some other evidence where you're saying, okay, we're proposing this. The best example would be master plans where you can get smaller setbacks or higher density in exchange for things that the community has deemed desirable, in the code. So then you're saying, okay, we first analyzed it according to the baseline, the clear objective, and if I can't, then I have to prepare the other set of things. And so the cost could be, hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, depending on the size of the site and other things. So there's a wide range of cost. It's mostly going to be people's time, the engineer's time, the planner's time, the surveyor's time, stuff like that.
And time to review, time for the planners to review as well.
The time is more the issue, honestly, than the money. I mean, the money counts, but it just adds months to the process.
Yeah.
Turns into money really quick.
Months and months, yeah.
I feel like I'm just looking for data to base this decision on, and the only one that's there between half to 1 acre already had met the floor by quite a bit. So I'm just like, I don't know what the base is off really.
And I think that what's unique about that site, and this is something where, Gina and I both have a lot of information about this site, but it's in a heavily wooded part of town. So there were lots of ponderosas already on the site. It also has a rock outcropping that's the 40% that's basically unbuildable anyway. So it's carefully developed. The big tree at the corner got preserved because it's outside the building footprint, but otherwise it was the unbuildable area also happened to have lots of trees on it. And so it's a great site. It's a great example. It's a good job picking a site that happened to do that is as much as, then good care and designing it is also a big factor.
So I'll switch mine to half acre to answer your question.
Okay. That puts us at 3. Karen, Chris, Brett, and Manoj also were in the no column. Although Manoj, you started at an acre. So not trying to make it too confusing, but right now we have, we still have a majority at yes with less than or equal to 1 acre. Lots of 3 p.m. I'm exhausted by this.
Yeah, I will switch mine to half an acre in hopes of a majority.
Brett, Karen, or Manoj, any further comments?
Still no.
Still no.
I don't think, all lots are so different.
6 to
Why
4.
is that?
There's 6 at 1 acre right now. 1, 2. I have 4 at a half acre. And 3 at none.
So all 3 of you would have to say yes for it to move to a half.
Or 2 tie.
Well, I think we're gonna get a split decision anyway. But.
Sure, also it's to a half.
Brett, did you want to change your vote or are you good?
I'll stay put, thank you.
So I think it's going to be an acre.
Yeah, that's the consensus.
I have 5 at a half and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at 1. Okay.
Yep. As uncomfortable as that is, that's better than a secret ballot one time. Like we had a discussion around it. So we have, we've heard everyone multiple times, I think. So quickly.
Okay, so we're going to go around the room, and the last question up on the screen is, now we know 1 acre or less is exempt. They can just clear cut the site. Do they have to mitigate for that 25% DVH? So they don't have to go through the trouble of trying to preserve trees, because we know that smaller sites are unique to develop in some cases, and some will still preserve trees because they don't want to mitigate. But the question is, do you want to require mitigation for the exempt lots?
Can I ask about that? The confusing part I have with that is, that seems less flexible if they have to mitigate, but they're exempt from the preservation. That takes something.
Well, they don't have to go through a discretionary process to get down to zero. They can just apply
If
and
they
not have
want
to
to
go through that.
preserve the 5%, we're not letting them, and they have.
Oh, no, they can. Yeah.
We're gonna draft it that they're exempt, but if they want to preserve, they can,
They're,
or they can mitigate. That doesn't make sense to me.
well, they're only exempt from the floor.
It's just
That's
the floor,
the-
not
that's what I
preservation
thought.
at all.
Just exempt from the floor.
That's my
Yeah,
understanding,
Just
yeah.
exempt from the floor.
So the rest of it.
That was
The
the.
rest still applies.
I didn't realize that's what we were talking about today. I thought we were talking about exempt from tree requirements. That's,
Just from the.
we're talking about this 5% thing on the bottom of the thing. That's all, that's the only thing we're talking about?
Yes,
Yes.
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 we haven't gotten to any.
So if you're an acre or larger, you are subject to either a floor, well, great if you do 20%, 25%, or you do placement or fee, but you would be down at the bottom at 5%, or you can go through a discretionary process if you're an acre or more. If you're less than an acre, you do not have to even put 5% on the property or go through a discretionary process. You simply get to design your project without the preservation of trees. But you may still have trees on there and you would mitigate. Which is incentive for you to still, you don't have to save any, you don't have to go through a discretionary process. But if you save a couple trees, you have less mitigation. Or do you just say they don't have to mitigate? Like they're exempt from everything.
Which is the question we were about to get to, right?
Yes.
And
Okay.
mitigate or fee in lieu, right?
Correct.
Mitigation is replace or fee in lieu.
Mhm.
Okay. So for the less than 1 acre that we just
1 acre.
straw polled, 1 acre or less.
Yes.
I've said it all the ways today. Less than or equal to 1 acre, down from the 5% floor, do they have to mitigate? Yes or no? Morgan?
No.
Kathy?
Yes.
Gina?
Sorry, I'm still slightly confused. Mitigate
For the 25% deviation.
for the 25%. No, I think the tree preservation code should apply to every size property, I think. And the smaller properties are gonna get weeded out by the development type. So I think the tree preservation standard should apply to all size properties. If there's a floor, that would only apply above the group voted 1 acre.
So I think.
So yes, mitigation.
So yes,
Okay.
mitigation, because okay, got it.
I say no, and I have to run, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay, thank you.
Thanks, Corey.
Yes.
Manoj?
Yes.
No.
Eric?
Sorry, can I ask, what is the mitigation requirement? Well, how do you mitigate for these trees? You add up the total diameters, sum those up, and then you have to replace some percentage
So
of the
it's
total
that,
diameter?
So you're not able to do the 25% DVH, so then you'd be mitigating for that.
How do you mitigate for that?
That's the.
How do you-
we talked
That's
about last
what we
time,
did
where
last
if it's a certain size, it's 1-to-1. If it's a larger size,
This
it's
is by
1-to-2.
the sum of the diameter of what you're putting back on the site.
Yeah, it's the DVH.
No, I don't want to.
Karen? Oh, sorry, Sarah.
Oh,
Did you have
just
an
my
opinion?
opinion.
Yes, your opinion. Karen?
I'm still down to my 0.9 acre property with 9 huge ponderosas. 3 of them are right on the property line. And what you're saying is that someone can replace a house with a fourplex, but they could also take down those 3 trees on the property line.
Well, in your case, the 3-plex would be exempt because it's under HB 2001. So it would have to be a 5-plex or greater, subject to site plan review, that would be subject to this code, just to be clear.
So if you did 5 units or more, you're at an acre, you're exempt. And so we're just trying to figure out if you don't have to save any trees, but should you be required to mitigate for the ones you cut down?
Yes.
Okay.
but I don't want those 3 taken down.
I don't think.
Understood. Chris?
Yes.
Brett?
I would say yes. I'd like to also, though, make mention, if my no exemption vote then automatically made the majority vote go to an acre, I will then recall that, go to a half acre.
But he was at none and he went to a half.
That's right.
It was okay.
I think he said.
Is that
no.
clear?
I heard that.
He said no. Him and Karen both said no to switching, but he is switching.
Yeah, Chris switched. Brett did.
I think it's still less.
Wellington
No, still less.
It would be 6-6,
Oh, that's
right?
right. Yeah, still less.
Wait, I think it's 6-6, isn't it?
6-5.
No, it's 6-5. Okay.
No, Karen, all three knows what I'm switch for it to be.
Was it, so is that tied though? Or it's,
So
No,
if,
because
I thought it was
Karen didn't-
6-6.
if Dan, Chris, Manoj, hubby, Gina.
Dan didn't get, Fred just did.
Right.
But we shouldn't be going back in votes now, you're doing one, so I would say, why don't you finish this one?
Yeah.
People have to go back.
Well, it might change other people's opinion as to how they vote.
Yeah, I hear you, Brett. It's just Dan and me. Let's quickly wrap that and then we'll piece Pauline's head back together and then figure out where we go next. Dan, what was your on mitigate?
Yes on mitigation.
I'm going to say no on mitigation. So
So yes, it's
it's a yes from the group. Okay. We are at a hard stop. And we're back to we have a wrench on the question of half acre versus 1 acre.
I feel like, here's Dan's opinion, but I feel like you could have your correct GIS team kind of look at where those half acre parcels are and see like if where the road access is.
well, our next meeting is our last one. And so we
Oh.
are gonna get to the vote at the next meeting, so we can move this into the timeline that we've agreed upon with council.
Right.
Yeah.
So we are, I think if Brett flips to a half, then it is a tie.
So maybe that's the recommendation of the council is that they.
There's a half or a
decide.
1
They get
acre.
to choose.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
or you-
That- and that is
You're
possible
right.
for us
You're
to
like, I
do.
touch this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
3/4 acre.
Congratulations.
Yeah, exactly. 3.75.
And then the next meeting is, I wrote it down.
December 5th at 10 a.m. here. And it will be to reconcile or to go through the outcome of that is for us to vote on the recommendations that get sent to staff and council so that then it can begin to work its way from staff to planning commission and then to council for decision where there will be public input requested along the way.
And on the tree replacement, Covey brought up that he remembers it differently, and I may have missed, when I listened to the minutes, it got very confusing in the end on how that vote actually happened. So we're gonna listen to it again, and then when you get the agenda with the recommendations outlined, then you'll see what we believe we heard for that.
Thank you, everybody.
I just want to support Chris's
Yep.
earlier point, the carrot part, and some of the recommendations that we've talked about we'll have as a supplement.
They definitely
Can we
will be.
include that in our next meeting?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, just have that mix.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Is there another